Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
My name is Lindsay Calloway, and I'm a researcher at the EFC. Our guests today are John Bowen and Jeremy McClung. John is Professor Emeritus of Evangelism at Wycliffe College in Toronto, and he has decades of experience serving with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Jeremy is the Transitional Director of the Institute of Evangelism at Wycliffe College, and he's passionate about learning how churches and individuals can effectively share the gospel. So if you haven't guessed it yet, we'll be talking with John and Jeremy about evangelism and their recent findings from a report that studied how Christians in Canada find faith as adults. I'm also pleased to introduce Christie Chan as my co-host today. She recently joined me and Rick Heemstra as a member of the research team. You'll have a chance to hear more from Christie at the end of our episode, so stick around for that conversation.
So I think hearing about how people became Christians always fascinated me because each story is just so unique. For some, it was like an event, kind of like Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. And for some, it was more of a longer process. And it took years of searching, questioning, building trust, and finding answers. And it might not have been a discernible moment, but rather a combination of a process and specific moment. And I'm sure that some of this will be reflected from John and Jeremy's research on how Canadians became Christians. And so before we dive right into that, John and Jeremy, would you be able to tell us what your research is about and what were you hoping to learn by looking at how Canadians became Christians?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. Let me just start it off. I taught evangelism at Wycliffe College for 20 years, and I was being pulled in two directions. One was reading reports about people dropping out of church, people giving up faith. You'll remember the hemorrhaging faith report, which was so depressing, although important. And at the same time, I was meeting people in churches and at the college who say, "Oh yeah, I just became a Christian a few years ago." I thought, this is really strange. Okay, there is a cultural current running one way, but there are people swimming against the tide. That's so strange. Who are they? And why are they becoming Christians when so many people seem to be going the other way? So that was the initial impetus. And then in my own teaching, I had used what is now an old book from 1992 called Finding Faith Today, How Does It Happen? It's by an English Anglican called John Finney. As you know, no good deed ever goes unpunished, and he later became a bishop. That was his punishment. But he did a lot of surveys and interviews to find out exactly the subject. How did people become Christians? What were the influences? How long did it take? What changed in your life? So I think that got me thinking, someone should do a Finding Faith Today equivalent for Canada. Then more recently, Brian Stone, who teaches evangelism at Boston College, wrote, I saw this book on a book table and it was called Finding Faith. And I thought, yeah, it's a suspicious title. And indeed, he was riffing off the British book, but doing it for the States. And although I was not born in this country, I'm now a loyal Canadian. And the first thing I know is Canada is different from the States. So it kind of motivated me further to say, we need to figure out what exactly is going on in Canada.
Yeah, for me, I had planted a church and seen people come to faith, but it didn't happen the way that it was supposed to, the way that I had sort of preconceived in my head. And so that led me to a lot of curiosity about what really does go on when someone becomes a Christian. It didn't seem to be the big dramatic event that I thought it should be. In fact, sometimes I couldn't even discern any point. I just knew that when they started coming to the church, they objectively were not Christians, and at some point they had become Christians. And so I actually did my master's research at McMaster Divinity College on this topic, trying to find out, what exactly is happening here. And in that process found Finney's book to be one of the most helpful. And so I heard John talking about this research project at lunch one day at Wycliffe College, and I elbowed my way in and said I would love to be a part of the project. And so my questions had more to do with the kind of the inner dynamics of what happens inside of someone as they come to faith. And John's largely focused around the church and the social context and things like that. And so it was sort of a complementary pairing we took into the research.
Well, we're glad that you did this research and that Canadians are able to benefit from your findings. At EFC, we just are coming off of a project where we focused on Christian families and looked at the factors and patterns that help children grow up in Christian families and to grow up in the faith. But your study, on the other hand, you were really looking at adults and you were interested in those who were unchurched growing up. So what's the importance of this focus?
I mean, as someone who grew up in church and then made a personal commitment to Christ outside of church at the age of 16, I'm very aware looking back that my church background meant that I knew the stories, I had heard the terminology, I had some sense of what sin and repentance and the kingdom meant, and therefore to make a commitment in some ways was conceptually easy. It wasn't introducing me to a whole alien world of thought. It was simply saying, you know all this stuff, but have you actually taken this logical step? If it is true, what are you going to do about it? And I think that's true for many who grew up in church or with a Christian background. If you had none of that, and their number is growing by the day, obviously you're starting much further back. You don't understand words like sin, repentance, kingdom, discipleship. I'm tempted to say you can assume that it's going to take longer. I mean, God will do what God will do, but humanly speaking, it is more normal for things to take longer. For me, the first time I heard this message about commitment, it made perfect sense. I made the commitment. For someone who's never heard any of it, it's likely to take longer. What would you say, Jeremy?
Yeah, I agree. This is a group of people I was definitely curious about. One of the frustrations that we ran into along the way, and I should say both of us are fairly new to this type of research. And so we did make some mistakes. And I think one of those was that we failed to be clear enough that we were looking for people without church background. And so we did find that a lot of our respondents did have church background. And so we actually had to go through a process of separating. I think it was about a third maybe that had no church background, with about 2/3 that had some sort of church influence in their life before becoming Christian. So that was a challenge of ours, a few challenges that we ran into along the way.
I mean, Lindsay, our key question was, are you a person who did not grow up as a Christian, but you now self-identify as a Christian? And the polling company we worked with said, yep, that's a good question. And of course, what we failed to realize was, if you grew up in church, but you hadn't made a real commitment, as I myself hadn't, you were likely to say, oh yeah, that's me. I wasn't a Christian, and now I am a Christian. But in fact, you had all that background in church and in Christian understanding.
I think that's a great point. I found it interesting that a significant number of respondents became a Christian from the ages of 41 to 70. Did you find that surprising, and what does that show us about your sample?
I suppose without actually looking into it, I had assumed the conventional wisdom that people become Christians in their late teens, which indeed I did. And I remember an article in Christianity Today contrasting that with Westerners who were becoming Muslims, and that was generally in their 30s. I didn't really know what to do with that, but it was an interesting contrast. And then in our research, we found that while 2/3 of our respondents did become Christians before the age of 40, not 20, but 40, a whole 1/3 became Christians in, maybe I can call it the second half of life. So yeah, that was surprising.
Another thing that you observed was that almost 20% of your respondents said that their conversion happened over a decade. And, I think at least in the Evangelical church, we're primed to think of conversion more as a moment in time. You hear it in the language where conversion is linked to maybe a prayer or a moment of dedication or rededication. So what are some of the implications for understanding conversion to include this idea of a process rather than just an event?
Yes, this is something that came out in Finney's research, before the year 2000. And Christie, you mentioned this yourself, that our image is generally that of Paul on the Damascus Road and praying that people will have that kind of experience. Although even if we look at Paul himself, clearly there was a long process that led up to this. His dissatisfaction with the law, that he found he couldn't obey the law, his witnessing of the death of Stephen, all of those things were ploughing the soil and sowing the seed. So it wasn't really out of the blue in the way that it appeared to be. And I've certainly incorporated that idea of the process into my teaching and said, do our churches give space to people who need to take a year or 2 or 3 to decide to follow Christ? Because even though I acknowledge the importance of a process, I do feel after a year, oh, come on, surely you get it now. And yet God takes whatever time seems to be necessary for the individual. So how do we weave that into our understanding of evangelism? How do we give people space? I mean, I do think teaching evangelism, which is things like Alpha, Christianity 101, Christianity Rediscovered, are good because they'll give people a session of content, and then you've got a week to process it, think about it, ask your questions, maybe pray about the things that are coming up. So that allows for the process to take place over a period of time. So it can be done that we weave this into our approach to evangelism.
I think I would add to that too. Some people may have trouble with a theological concept, like how does that work? New birth. Yeah, I realized in the process of this actually that birth is a process that actually takes quite a bit of time, and I should have known that. But sometimes I think of the new birth as like an instantaneous thing. But there are theological concepts like regeneration and things like that that we often think of as being instantaneous, like there is a moment where that happens. And I don't think that our research is saying anything theologically like that doesn't happen. It just is questioning our ability to necessarily discern that moment or to bring about that moment. And it's acknowledging that there are a lot of things that go before and come after in a healthy process of conversion. So I think it's important not to get the kind of theological details of this mixed up with the experiential, which, I mean, both are important, but our research has focused on the experience of the people themselves as they describe it.
Sure, that's helpful. Yeah.
I mean, Christie, I've often made reference to the number of times that Jesus' parables are about agriculture, which involves a long process. And the God who created those natural processes is the same God who works through the supernatural processes. And I've sometimes challenged people to think, if this is so, our evangelism should not focus entirely on reaping. What events do you have in your Christian community that help to break up the soil? What events do you have that are simply sowing and not expecting to see a harvest straight away? How do you water the crop? I mean, at Corinth, Paul says, I sowed the seed, but Apollos watered it. Well, what exactly did Apollos do? I mean, my guess is he did evangelistic Bible studies, but that's just my background coming out. They'd heard the message. What the heck is he talking about? Where is this in the Bible? Hey, help me understand this. So it's the whole of that. I mean, when Harold Percy was at Trinity Streetsville, every year on the Saturday closest to Valentine's Day, I'm sorry, this is not to do with the research, but it's a good story, the church would do a dinner and dance in a local community hall. And they would have the dinner, and before the dance, Harold would get up and preach a brilliant evangelistic sermon, which went like this. You may wonder why a church would celebrate Valentine's Day. We don't celebrate Queen Victoria's birthday or Groundhog Day. But you know what? Over at Trinity Streetsville, we worship the God who invented love. So naturally, we want to celebrate this day that speaks of love. And if you feel you could be a better lover, then you should join us one of these Sundays and figure out how to be a better lover. It was brilliant. But you didn't expect anyone to become a Christian there. It was breaking up the soil, and indeed people who'd been to the dinner, then did come to the church and did in time become Christians. But we don't often think as long-term as that.
Sounds very suspicious to me, John. Dancing at a church event?
It is. Well, you didn't have to. You could sit that part out, just enjoy the dinner.
And pray for those who were dancing.
Yeah, pray for the sinners who were dancing, it's true.
I think these are really good points, and it challenges us to think more about how we view evangelism. And part of your research talked about what and who influenced your respondents to become Christians. And a relatively large number of respondents in your sample indicated that friendship with a Christian was an important influencer over parents, children, family, pastor, minister, or even one spouse. Did you find that surprising, and what are some implications for this?
I don't think that we found that all that surprising, honestly. I think both of us are big believers in relational evangelism, that it happens best through friendships, through relationships. I think that what we do with that is important, because it would be easy to take that and then use friendship as a tactic to, win people to Christ. And I think that's really dangerous. I think friendship needs to be sincere, authentic friendship that comes with a hope, but not an agenda. Maybe that's a good way to say it. So that you hope that you can help bring these people to Christ, but that your friendship doesn't depend on it, or it's not built on only seeing that happen. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when you look at the length of time that it took people to become Christians. More than a third say it was more than 4 years. And as you mentioned, about 20% said it was more than 10 years. And so I think it's really important for when you're thinking about evangelism through friendship, realizing that it's friendship for the long haul, not just a project friendship. And it's also interesting to look at what respondents said that the friends did. The top 3 things that they did for their friends were pretty simple. Demonstrated the love of Christ, that was number 1. Invited to church was number 2. Lived an attractive life is number 3. So that's a pretty simple approach to evangelism, really. Now, sometimes you hear the phrase, whoever said it, to preach at all times and when necessary use words. And it did come out that it is necessary to use words, because the next 3 most important things were that their friends answered questions, that they taught the practical aspects of the Christian life, and that they did share the gospel with them. So those things are important, but I think it goes to show that evangelism is not something that's unattainable for people. It might take them out of their comfort zones, but it really is something that normal people can do, which sounds like a good title for a book, Evangelism for Normal People.
Let me make note of that. Yeah, that would be great. Yes, thank you.
Okay, that is one of John's books.
We'll look for that.
If I can build on that, that saying, preach the gospel by all means, if necessary, use words, is attributed to St. Francis. It seems as though historically it is 99% certain that he never said it, because he was himself a preacher. He taught his followers to preach. Ed Stetzer says that saying is rather like saying, feed the hungry at all times. If necessary, use food, which is pretty clever. I've used this insight about friendship to critique what I like to call vacuum cleaner church. I mean, I think if you are the pastor, it is very easy to think your finest models of Christian faith are those who are most involved in the life of the church, who are there on committees, doing this, that, and the other, 5 nights of the week. And we worry more about the people who are not there as often, don't volunteer to serve on as many committees, but maybe they are the ones who are making friends in the community. Maybe we need, instead of the vacuum cleaner sucking people in, maybe the vacuum cleaner should be pushing people out. I remember one church where I said, well, you could be doing, in the summer, you could be doing barbecues in your homes out in the community. And they looked at me in surprise, said, well, we do that every summer. And I said, well, who comes to your barbecues? And they said, well, we do. Meaning it was by church members and it was for church members. And the thought of inviting the people on their street was a totally new idea.
So are you thinking of leaf blower church, John?
That's not a bad image. Yeah, I sure. Do I have to credit you if I use that phrase?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I do wonder, I mean, this sounds naive, but do we need help in learning how to be a good friend? How to make ourselves vulnerable? Yeah, it sounds obvious, but we are most easily drawn to friendships with people who think like us on the most important issues of life. And if you're a Christian, that's other Christians. how do we find people in other walks of life? Yeah, things that we're interested in, maybe sports or games or other charities. Where do we just make friends? And can we encourage people to do that without them feeling, or without us giving the impression, actually they're backsliding if they do that?
Right.
Maybe we have Alpha that teaches non-Christians what it means to, be a Christian. Maybe we need like a beta course or something that teaches Christians how to be just normal people.
Yes. And I've recently come across the verb guesting, to guest. I guessed, you guessed. Not Guessed, but Guest.
Okay.
I mean, I know the importance of welcoming people into my life, into my home, but do I know how to be a guest at the table of other people? I have a group of friends I meet regularly for coffee. I was invited to be part of that group. And at first it was, to be honest, a little bit threatening. And now I feel very much at home with those people. And I realize, yes, there is something important about this. And indeed Christ-like, because Jesus was a guest in the home of Mary and Martha, at the table of Simon the Pharisee. He knew how to make himself at home in, let us say, non-religious settings. He wasn't on his own turf. We like to see people on our own turf. It's safer for us, but not for them.
Yeah, we definitely do. That's really interesting. I think, just to think about how we promote that kind of culture in our churches, especially in 2023. I'm just thinking of polarization in so many different areas. It's going to take concerted effort on the part of Christians to do this. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. One thing I want to touch on, you talked about how becoming a Christian, you wanted to not only measure how people become Christian, but maybe how some of their lives or values, how they change in response. And if Christianity made a negative or positive change in those people's lives. So you noted that nearly half of respondents said that certain practices and values didn't change when becoming a Christian. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that maybe shapes what we expect from people who come to faith?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things we measured was just simple Christian practices. So we chose church attendance, getting together with some sort of a small group, and doing personal prayer and Bible reading as just kind of some very simplistic markers of what Christians might do. And we wanted to see how those had changed kind of from before they were Christian to after. And we didn't see a lot of change, and we didn't see a lot of practice. I think Bible reading and prayer was the most often, a whopping 1 or 2 times a month. Church was somewhere around once a month or so. And small group was just very occasional for people. And I listened to your podcast talking about the Cardis report on scripture engagement. And I thought that it really lined up with that. I don't think it's all that surprising to see new Christians not displaying a lot of marks of, strong commitment when a lot of existing Christians don't. We kind of disciple people into what's already existing and what they can see. So that wasn't hugely surprising. We also asked about some markers like, how has your life changed in terms of character? And 68% of people said that they were more forgiving. That was the top answer, which I thought was good. That indicates that people are getting grace and getting the fact that God has forgiven them and expects, them to be gracious to others. But what was disturbing is that almost half of respondents only chose one area where they had felt like they had grown in terms of character, out of quite a number that we gave them, and they could choose as many as they want. So it seems like people didn't really perceive themselves to have changed all that much in terms of character. We also looked at some, more hot button political issues, which I'll let John speak to.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wondered, this is something I got from Brian Stone. He had asked, have your views changed on abortion, same-sex marriage, gun control, equality for women, etc.? I think the main change was on abortion, that people who were okay with it before were less likely to be okay with it afterwards. But again, a lot didn't change their minds. I mean, again, there are some things where you wouldn't expect people, once they become Christians, to change their mind, but I think I was surprised that there wasn't more change. Both Brian Stone and ourselves found that the biggest change was people were more in favour of care for the environment. But again, that would be nice to think, oh, well, obviously they've received a lot of teaching about that, they've heard a lot of sermons on that. But Jeremy pointed out, but that has changed in the culture at large. So the concern for the environment may have gone up simply because it has gone up across our culture in general. So again, it was a little troubling to think, how far are new Christians learning to think with the mind of Christ on any of these things? Is that a fair summary, Jeremy?
Yeah, and it brings to mind something else that I think was unique about our survey, was that we started with sort of a general population sample, and we used a polling company to do it. What that meant was that people self-defined whether they became Christians or not, which meant that the study included Christians from all stripes: Catholic, Protestant, conservative, liberal. And what was interesting was seeing how those with liberal political views, I mean, you can divide them into stereotypical liberal conservative viewpoints, but they really didn't change all that much when it came to their political views or their views on ethical topics like these, which was, just interesting. A lot of times surveys like this will focus on, if it's evangelicals doing the survey, it'll focus on a more evangelical definition of what it means to be a Christian. But since we allowed people to define that for themselves, it really caught a lot more, and I think was interesting to see some of those additional insights.
So I think it has been a very fruitful conversation, and there's a lot more to think about now based on our discussion today. And to wrap up our conversations for today, what would you recommend individuals, churches, and ministries who are doing evangelism or looking to improve their evangelistic efforts?
I think that it's pretty clear that it's a process that we need to orient ourselves toward seeing a process happen. And even if your tradition, your background, or your personality kind of leads you to focus on an event, to recognize that there's a lot that leads up to that event, and there's a lot that needs to go afterwards to send people on the right trajectory in their faith. That was something that also came out in our study, was that very little was being done to support new Christians in terms of what, how to set them on that right path forward. The biggest thing they said by far was just that they were encouraged to attend church, which is a good I hope is a good discipling exercise, but it's a great reminder that those of us who lead churches need to make sure that we are offering in church explanations, that we're making things accessible for people who are new to the faith. The other thing that I was really interested in was what was going on inside. And what came out of the survey there was that really it's a very holistic experience, that conversion affects people's thinking, their worldview, their beliefs. It affects their emotions. There is this affection that grows toward God, this relational experience. There's a social aspect of joining a church, of becoming part of God's family. There is a decision aspect mixed in there. And I think it's important that when you look as a church or as an organization or as an individual, that you look at all of those aspects. We have a tendency to focus on our favorite, if that's, the intellectual, the apologetics, or the experiential, the emotional. And so to think in a more holistic way, because people really did describe their experience as involving all of those things.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things. I think in our evangelistic preaching, if we know that we have a mixed audience, some are Christians and some are not, to take seriously the idea of the process, clearing stones, sowing, watering, being patient, and finally reaping. And I will often say, I don't know where you're at in your journey, but in light of what you've been hearing, what might be the next step for you? So if this is totally new, maybe the first step for you is to read one of the first biographies of Jesus. maybe by his friend John. That would be a great starting place. Maybe it would be good to try praying and see what happens. I mean, you can make up as many steps as you think is appropriate. And then again to say, but maybe you've been thinking about this a long time. Maybe you're sitting on the fence. And maybe now is the time to say yes to Jesus. So to encourage people not to say that big yes to Jesus necessarily, they may not be ready for that. And frankly, we don't want people to make a premature decision and wake up 2 days later and think, what the heck have I just done? That was ridiculous. I didn't mean it. But to ask them to discern, what should I do next as I'm on this journey? Anne Lamott talks about her journey to faith as being like a frog leaping from one lily pad to another. So it's fairly random, and sometimes she fell in the water and she'd have to scramble out. So it sounds an odd way to put it, but can we provide those lily pads, say, well, if you're on this lily pad, maybe this is the next one to try jumping to. I'm sure there's a better image than that somewhere, but to weave that into our evangelistic preaching. And also to be on the lookout for where God is at work in someone's life. I know it sounds obvious, but I was very struck by when we asked people, what was it in your life that made you think about this? Only around 10% said, well, I felt guilty for my sins. And again, traditionally, I think we have often started by saying, you have done wrong, you're a sinner in the eyes of God, you need to repent. I think repentance means two things. One is, it certainly means I will stop fiddling on my income tax. But the bigger way is I need to surrender control of my life to Jesus and his work of the kingdom. And as time goes on, he will figure out the specific sins in my life that need to be dealt with. That may be heresy, but I want to learn to recognize where is God at work in people's lives. For many of our respondents, it was, I had no sense of meaning in my life. I had no sense of purpose in my life. I was curious about God. Guilt will come in at the time that the Holy Spirit brings it in. But what we're seeking is to get people to consider Jesus and take those first steps towards following him. And once they're on that journey, he will look after the rest.
This has been so thought-provoking, and I'm just wondering if our listeners want to get in touch with you, or if they want to learn more on this topic, where can they do that?
So for me, you can just Google Institute of Evangelism at Wycliffe College, and you can find my contact information there, and you can actually find the 20-page report on our research. We'd be happy to field any questions about that. If you just go to the Institute of Evangelism website, you'll find that there.
And I'm at john.bowen@utoronto.ca. That's very easy, john.bowen@utoronto.ca. I'd be delighted to hear from anybody.
That's great. Well, we'll definitely include those in the show notes. I'll also link to our episode that Jeremy mentioned with Deacon Andrew Bennett, where we talked about the Bible and Christian engagement there. We'll include John Finney's book as well and a link to this report. John and Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lindsay and Christie. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
That was a really great conversation with Jeremy and John. And Christie, welcome to the Faith Trends podcast. We really just threw you into hosting, so you did a great job. I'm really curious to know, I know that you have a background in studying youth ministry, and I just want to know how you found this conversation, how that's relevant to your experience.
Well, yeah, I have a background in children's and youth ministry for the past 8 years. I would say that a lot of things that we talked about are really relevant, because oftentimes when we ask, well, at least for my church and experiences, when we ask the youth if they want to get baptized, what is their faith journey like? And oftentimes it always seems that there has to be some kind of prescribed model, I guess, like before you were a Christian, when you became a Christian, and usually afterwards, how has your life changed? But I also think that for a lot of people, it's very hard to pinpoint necessarily like a specific date, time, or event. And just like what we talked about today, I think with Jeremy and John, oftentimes it can be a process. It can be even a long process. And I think that's something that I think it would be helpful for people to understand, that coming to know Jesus doesn't always have to look like a very supernatural experience or something that is like an event or at a conference, at an altar call, other stories where people wrestle with what it even means to become a Christian or what faith actually means like.
So what John said about this idea about the lily pads, I found that a really helpful analogy, even though he didn't think it was very helpful. But, I can think of this in my own experience when I think about my own conversion. I grew up in a small Baptist church. I was baptized at the age of 12, and it was Easter. My whole family was getting baptized. We were doing sort of an Acts 16 thing. And I really believe I made a genuine confession when I was 12, but I can't say that it all really clicked for me until several years later. So I think there's quite a few people who we look at it more as a constellation of events maybe. So, it's not saying that the way that we've been doing evangelism or thinking about conversion is wrong. I think we're maybe thinking about it more deeply. And I loved also that the imagery of agriculture that John had been talking about too. How can we be thinking about the seeds that we're sowing and who is doing the watering and who is kind of removing some of those barriers? It doesn't have to, that we all know that doesn't happen in one event. And that really speaks to the relationships that we need to develop with people. So I'm glad, you have the experience of building those relationships with youth. They have a ton of questions. My husband's a young adults pastor. Young adults in university, they have a ton of questions. And I think it's also encouraging just to see the amount of adults between the ages of 40 and 70 in this study who also became Christians later in life, and seeing that was a process that took several years. And clearly they had people in their lives who were walking with them. So, there were some discouraging things in their findings, but I thought most of it was very encouraging and very hopeful that the way to lead people to Jesus is very simple. It's very relational, and it's just being committed and being there and being constant. So I found that a really hopeful message from that conversation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Lindsay. I know that for myself, in terms of becoming a Christian, I said that kind of prayer when I was 6 years old, but it took me until probably like my early 20s to really start to know or to come to know what that really meant. And through that, obviously, there were a lot of moments of believing or doubting, running away, running back, journeying with people. And so I'm really glad that, today we got to hear more about how normal it is, I guess, to have a process, a journey in coming to know Jesus. And I think I also liked how they emphasized what happens after that, because I think it is really important about like the follow-up or even starting to where do you start from, right? Like after you've said a prayer or after you decided to become a Christian, what are usually the next steps? And I think that oftentimes it's like when there is no follow-up, I think that's probably a very hard transition and where most people just aren't sure what to do.
So John talked about churches maybe hosting barbecues or church members hosting barbecues and not just inviting those people who are like them, but inviting the people in their neighborhoods. And I think that's hard for us. It's hard to evangelize. It takes vulnerability. And a lot of people maybe have a lot of assumptions about Christianity, and they don't really want to hear it because they have built up an idea in their mind of what it means to be a Christian, and they don't want anything to do with that. But the only thing that will probably ultimately change their mind is consistently relating to Christians and seeing that the stereotypical Christian that they have built up in their mind is not what they see in front of them. And so I was challenged by John to think about how can I make myself more available to non-Christians in order to show them the love of Christ through my words and my deeds.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about that, Lindsay. As I'm reflecting on Jeremy and John's research today, where they talk about creating space to get to know other people, and also the importance of friendships, friendships needing to be sincere and authentic, coming with hope but not an agenda. As we can see based on the research, becoming a Christian can be a 10-year journey, things like that. And so we can learn more about that through perhaps just even trying to reach out to people, our neighbors and things like that, but also reading Jeremy and John's research.
It sounds like there are expectations that need to be shattered on both our sides. So expectations for quick responses to our evangelistic efforts and our project friendships, and expectations about Christians that we can also shatter just by sharing life.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.